In the shadow of ancient stones where desert winds whisper secrets older than Christianity itself, 9 knights knelt in a circle that would reshape the destiny of 2 civilizations. But what if everything you've been told about their holy mission was a carefully constructed lie? What if their true purpose was not to protect pilgrims, but to plunder the mystical treasures of pharaohs who had been dust for 3,000 years? Picture this: Jerusalem, 1118. The city still bears the scars of conquest, its stones stained with the blood of 3 faiths. In the ruins of Solomon's temple, 9 French knights swear an oath that history records as noble and pure. But in the shadows beyond their torchlight, other figures watch men whose knowledge stretches back to the time when gods walked among the pyramids, when magic flowed through amulets of gold and jewel, when the dead spoke through objects that held the very essence of immortal power. You see, what the chronicles never tell you is this: the Knights Templar didn't just stumble upon wealth and influence through battlefield prowess and banking innovation. They discovered something far more valuable, far more dangerous. In the buried vaults beneath Jerusalem, in the hidden chambers of Alexandria's lost library, in the secret workshops of Cairo's most mysterious craftsmen, they found the magical objects of ancient Egypt, artifacts so powerful that they could grant their wielders abilities that seemed divine. Tonight, we follow the trail of the greatest treasure hunt in history, a mystery that begins with 9 poor knights and ends with a fortune so vast it vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers, symbols, and a legacy that still shapes our world today. This isn't just about gold or silver. This is about objects that could bend reality itself, relics that made their owners untouchable, and secrets so dangerous that kings and popes would stop at nothing to possess them. Like the video and subscribe, because tonight we uncover what really happened to the lost treasure of the Knights Templar, and why after 700 years it still refuses to be found. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Jerusalem as 9 men in simple brown robes approached the gates of the royal palace. They carried no banners, bore no coat of arms, and possessed nothing but the clothes on their backs and swords at their sides. To the guards they looked like pilgrims or perhaps minor nobles fallen on hard times. But appearances, as history would prove, can be the most dangerous deceptions of all. These 9 men were about to change the course of 2 continents. Their names would become legend: Hugues de Payens, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, André de Montbard, Payen de Montdier, Archambaud de Saint-Agnan, Gondomar, Rossal, Jacques de Montignac, and Philippe de Bordeaux. 9 Frenchmen who claimed they had traveled across hostile lands for one simple purpose: to protect Christian pilgrims on their dangerous journey to the holy sites. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem received them in his throne room, a chamber that still echoed with the ghostly presence of ancient kings. The walls bore inscriptions in Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin, remnants of empires that had risen and fallen on this same ground. When Hugues de Payens spoke, his words were measured, humble, almost apologetic. He explained that they sought nothing more than permission to patrol the roads, to guard the faithful, to serve God and King without reward. But here's what the chroniclers missed, what the official histories never recorded. These 9 knights didn't choose their mission randomly. They had been chosen. Months before their arrival in Jerusalem, secret meetings had taken place in the castles of France. Ancient manuscripts had been consulted, maps drawn from sources that predated Rome itself. These men had come not as simple guardians, but as seekers of something specific, something that lay hidden beneath the very stones of Jerusalem. King Baldwin, desperate for any help in securing his fragile kingdom, granted their request without hesitation. He offered them quarters in the royal palace itself, but the knights declined with gracious thanks. They had, they said, already selected their dwelling place. They wished to live in the ruins of Solomon's temple, on the Temple Mount, where they could pray and keep vigil in the holiest of places. What Baldwin didn't know, what no one knew, was that these ruins held more than religious significance. Beneath the broken stones and collapsed walls lay a labyrinth of chambers, tunnels, and vaults that stretched deep into the bedrock of Jerusalem. Jewish texts spoke of King Solomon's treasures hidden there before the Babylonian conquest. Islamic scholars whispered of jinn bottles sealed in darkness. Christian pilgrims claimed to have heard voices of angels echoing from below. But the 9 knights had come with knowledge that transcended all 3 faiths. They possessed fragments of texts that spoke of Egyptian sages who had visited Solomon's court, who had shared with the wise king secrets older than written history. These sages had not come empty-handed. They had brought with them objects of power, relics from the time of the pharaohs, artifacts that could grant their wielders abilities that seemed to touch the divine. As the sun set on their first day in Jerusalem, the 9 knights stood on the Temple Mount, looking out over a city that had been conquered by Romans, Persians, Arabs, and Crusaders. Each empire had left its mark, but none had found what lay sleeping beneath their feet. That would change, because these 9 men had not come to protect pilgrims or serve kings. They had come to wake something that had been dormant for centuries. The following morning, they began to dig. For 9 years, the Knights Templar lived like hermits on the Temple Mount. To the outside world, they appeared to be 9 men of extraordinary devotion, spending their days in prayer and their nights in meditation. Pilgrims who glimpsed them described knights who seemed almost ghostly, moving through the ruins like guardians of some ancient covenant. But beneath the surface, in the dark tunnels they excavated grain by grain, stone by stone, something extraordinary was taking place. The work was methodical, almost scientific. These were not treasure hunters frantically digging for gold. They were archaeologists before the word existed, following maps and diagrams that had been copied and recopied for centuries. The manuscripts they carried were written in languages most scholars couldn't read: hieratic Egyptian, ancient Aramaic, and scripts that predated the rise of Greece and Rome. Imagine descending into those tunnels with them. The air grows cold and stale as you move deeper underground. Your torch flickers against walls carved with symbols that seem to shift and dance in the wavering light. Here, a cartouche bearing the name of Thutmose III. There, an inscription in ancient Hebrew describing vessels of gold and silver hidden until the time of restoration. And everywhere, the persistent sense that you are being watched by eyes that closed millennia ago but somehow never stopped seeing. What they found in those depths would transform them from 9 poor knights into the most powerful organization in medieval Europe. But it wasn't gold they discovered first. It wasn't silver or precious stones. It was knowledge. Scrolls wrapped in oiled leather, tablets carved from black stone, papyri that crumbled at the slightest touch, but revealed secrets that made their hearts race with possibilities they had never dared imagine. One fragment, written in Egyptian hieroglyphs with a Greek translation scribbled in the margins, described a ritual performed by the priests of Thoth. It told of how the god of wisdom had granted certain objects the power to transcend the natural laws that bound mortal men. These weren't mere symbols or decorations. They were tools, instruments of power that could allow their wielders to see through illusion, to speak across vast distances, to know the thoughts of enemies and allies alike. Another scroll, this one in Aramaic, told of King Solomon's dealings with the Queen of Sheba, but this wasn't the sanitized version found in biblical texts. This was the real story, the account of how the queen had brought with her more than spices and gold. She had carried objects from the tombs of the pharaohs, relics that had been blessed by gods whose names were forbidden to speak aloud. Solomon, wise beyond measure, had recognized their power and had hidden them away, waiting for a time when worthy guardians would emerge to claim them. But it was the third discovery that changed everything. Deep in a chamber that had been sealed with lead and marked with warnings in 7 languages, they found it. A single object that pulsed with an energy that made the very air around it shimmer like water. It was ancient beyond measure, crafted by hands that had known secrets lost before Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. The moment Hugis de Pians lifted it from its resting place, everything changed. The object felt warm in his hands, almost alive. As his fingers traced its surface, images flooded his mind. He saw himself as others saw him, but also as he could become. He saw the 9 knights not as they were, poor, struggling, forgotten, but as they would be. Leaders of an order that would span continents, guardians of wealth beyond imagination, wielders of power that would make kings kneel before them. That night, as the 9 knights gathered in their makeshift chamber on the Temple Mount, they knew their lives had been forever altered. They had found the first piece of Solomon's hidden cache, the beginning of a treasure that would take them years to fully uncover. But more than that, they had found their destiny. They had become the chosen guardians of Egypt's lost magic, the inheritors of power that had slept beneath Jerusalem's stones for 1,000 years. And now, that power was awakening. The transformation of the 9 knights didn't happen overnight, but when it came, it was so dramatic that chroniclers struggled to explain it. Within months of their mysterious years in the tunnels, letters began arriving in European courts from the most unexpected sources. Kings who had never heard of these humble knights suddenly spoke of them with reverence and fear. Popes who had shown no interest in their mission began granting them privileges that had never been given to any religious order. But it wasn't politics or diplomacy that opened these doors. It was demonstration. Picture Pope Honorius II in his private chambers in Rome, 1129. A letter has arrived from Jerusalem, carried by a knight who claims to represent Hugis de Pians. The letter itself is unremarkable, a simple request for papal recognition of their order. But when the papal secretary picks up the parchment, his hands begin to shake. The ink appears to move across the page, reorganizing itself into new words, new meanings. The message that emerges is not the humble petition the knights had written, but something else entirely. A revelation of the Pope's most secret fears, his hidden sins, his desperate need for guidance in matters no mortal should know. The knight who delivered the The letter stands silently in the corner, his face hidden by shadows that seem darker than they should be in the well-lit chamber. When he speaks, his voice carries an authority that makes the Pope's blood run cold. His Holiness will find our order useful, the knight says. Not a request, not even a suggestion, a statement of fact. Within weeks, the papal bull Omni Datum Optimum is issued, granting the Knights Templar independence from all authority except the Pope himself. They are given the right to build their own churches, collect their own taxes, even conduct their own burials. No king, no bishop, no earthly power can touch them. They have become untouchable. But how? How did 9 poor knights from France suddenly wield influence that rivaled emperors? The answer lies not in political maneuvering or military conquest, but in the objects they had discovered beneath Jerusalem, objects that had been crafted in the workshops of ancient Egypt, blessed by priests whose knowledge of the supernatural far exceeded anything known in medieval Europe. The first object they had found was just the beginning. As they continued their excavations, more treasures emerged from the darkness. A golden scarab that whispered the secrets of any man who looked upon it. An amulet shaped like the eye of Horus that allowed its wearer to see events happening hundreds of miles away. A ring bearing the cartouche of Akhenaten that could make its owner's words irresistibly compelling to anyone who heard them. These weren't mere decorations or symbols. They were functional tools crafted by a civilization that understood the hidden forces, underlying reality in ways that Christian Europe could barely comprehend. The ancient Egyptians hadn't just built monuments to their gods. They had built devices that allowed them to communicate with forces beyond the physical world, to manipulate probability itself to bend the will of men and gods alike to their purposes. André de Montbard de Hugues de Payen's uncle and one of the 9 founders, was the first to fully understand what they had discovered. A learned man who spoke Arabic and had studied the works of Islamic philosophers, he recognized the hieroglyphs and symbols carved on many of the objects. But more than that, he understood their purpose. "We have found the tools of the god-kings," he told his companions one night as they gathered around their discoveries. Objects that made Pharaoh more than mortal, that allowed him to rule not just through force or law, but through powers that transcended the natural world. And now those powers are ours. The implications were staggering. With these objects they could know their enemies' plans before their enemies knew them themselves. They could compel loyalty from the most stubborn nobles, could see through any deception, could turn the tide of battles not through superior numbers or tactics, but through advantages that their opponents couldn't even comprehend. But power always comes with a price. As the knights experimented with their discoveries, they began to change. Their eyes grew sharper, more knowing. Their words carried weight that made strong men tremble. They moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, as if they possessed knowledge that made them superior to ordinary mortals, because, in many ways they did. The objects they had found were more than just tools of power. They were teachers, passing on to their new owners fragments of the wisdom that had made ancient Egypt the most advanced civilization the world had ever known. And with that wisdom came responsibility. These weren't treasures to be hoarded or sold. They were weapons in a war that most people didn't even know was being fought. A war between the forces of knowledge and ignorance, between those who would use power to elevate humanity and those who would use it to enslave. The 9 knights had become players in a game that had been going on for thousands of years, inheritors of a struggle that had seen the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of religions, the endless cycle of civilizations reaching for greatness, only to fall back into darkness. And now, as they prepared to emerge from their tunnels and take their place in the world, they knew that everything depended on how they used what they had found. The treasures of Solomon's temple weren't just objects of power. They were tests, challenges designed to separate the worthy from the unworthy, the wise from the foolish. The question was, which would the Knights Templar prove to be? As news of the papal recognition spread, something remarkable happened to the Knights Templar. Nobles across Europe began offering them land, castles, and fortunes with a generosity that bordered on madness. King Louis VII of France granted them the temple in Paris. King Henry I of England gave them properties throughout his realm. Spanish kings fighting the Reconquista handed over entire cities. Within a decade, the 9 poor knights had become the wealthiest organization in Christendom, but this wasn't ordinary charity or religious devotion. Those who encountered the Templars directly came away changed, as if they had looked into the eyes of men who possessed secrets that made earthly power seem insignificant. Chronicles from the period describe meetings where hardened warriors would begin conversations as skeptics and end them as devoted supporters, having glimpsed something in the Templars' presence that convinced them they were dealing with more than mortal men. The truth was more extraordinary than anyone imagined. The objects the knights had discovered weren't just tools of individual power. They were part of a larger system, a network of interconnected artifacts that had once allowed the pharaohs of Egypt to maintain control over an empire that stretched from Nubia to the Euphrates. And now, piece by piece, the Templars were reassembling that network. In the deepest vaults beneath their new commanderies, they began to construct something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a communications network that allowed instant contact between their scattered holdings. Using objects inscribed with matching hieroglyphs, a commander in London could speak directly with his counterpart in Jerusalem, sharing intelligence and coordinating strategy in real time across thousands of miles. This wasn't magic in the fairy tale sense. It was technology, incredibly advanced technology, based on principles that wouldn't be rediscovered by mainstream science for another 800 years. The ancient Egyptians had understood that consciousness itself was a force that could be manipulated and directed, that properly constructed objects could serve as conduits for mental energy, allowing trained operators to project their thoughts across any distance. Jacques de Montaignac, the most scholarly of the 9 founders, spent years learning to read the hieroglyphic instructions that came with each artifact. What he discovered revolutionized his understanding of reality itself. The ancient Egyptians hadn't just worshipped their gods. They had been in direct communication with them. The objects the Templars had found were literally divine tools, crafted by beings whose consciousness operated on levels that human minds could barely comprehend. We are not the first to find these treasures. Jacques wrote in a secret journal that survived in the Templar archives. Throughout history, various groups have discovered fragments of this ancient knowledge. The oracle at Delphi, the wise men of Babylon, Even some of the early Christian saints all drew their power from objects like these. But never before has anyone assembled so many pieces of the puzzle. We stand on the threshold of understanding secrets that could reshape civilization itself. The implications were both thrilling and terrifying. If they could fully activate the network of artifacts, they would possess capabilities that would make them essentially invulnerable to any earthly power. They could see the future, control the past, and bend reality itself to their will. But such power came with dangers that even the wise pharaohs had not fully mastered. Several of the objects carried warnings in ancient Egyptian script, cautioning that improper use could tear holes in the fabric of existence itself. This was why the Knights maintained such extraordinary secrecy about their true activities. To the outside world, they were simply a military religious order, distinguished perhaps by their unusual wealth and influence, but ultimately comprehensible within the normal frameworks of medieval society. The reality was far more complex. They were the guardians of knowledge that predated Christianity by thousands of years, the inheritors of wisdom that could either save humanity or destroy it. But as their power grew, so did the attention of their enemies. There were others who knew about the ancient Egyptian artifacts, other bloodlines and secret societies that had been searching for these objects for centuries. The Templars' sudden rise had not gone unnoticed by those who understood what it really signified. Ancient rivalries were stirring. Powers that had slumbered for generations were beginning to wake, and in the shadows of European courts, whispers began to spread. Whispers about knights who seemed to know things they shouldn't know, who could predict the outcomes of battles before they were fought, who possessed objects that gleamed with their own inner light. The Templars had become more than powerful. They had become dangerous. The question was no longer how long they could hide their secrets. The question was how long their secrets would allow them to survive. By 1135, the Knights Templar had become a phenomenon that defied all explanation. Their transformation from 9 poor knights to the most influential organization in Christendom had happened so rapidly that even kings struggled to understand how it was possible. But for those who knew where to look, the signs were everywhere. Objects of impossible beauty and strange power had begun appearing in Templar commanderies across Europe. Artifacts that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, that whispered secrets in languages no living man could speak, that granted their wielders abilities that bordered on the divine. You need to understand something about these objects that the Templars had discovered. These weren't mere treasures or religious relics. They were technologies so advanced that medieval minds could only interpret them as magic. The ancient Egyptians had achieved a level of understanding about consciousness, energy, and the fundamental structure of reality that wouldn't be matched again for nearly 1,000 years. And now, that knowledge was in the hands of 9 knights who were only beginning to comprehend what they possessed. The first complete inventory of their treasures, written in Jacques de Montagnac's encrypted hand, reveals the true scope of what they had found beneath Jerusalem. The list reads like something from a fever dream. The Eye of Ra, which allows sight across vast distances and through the veils that hide men's hearts. The Scarab of Khepri, which grants knowledge of events yet to come. The Ankh of Asis, which can heal wounds that should be mortal and restore life to those who have passed beyond the threshold. the ring of Thoth, which makes its wearer's words become reality in the minds of those who hear them. But it was the crown jewel of their collection that truly set them apart from any other power in the medieval world. Deep in the most secure vault beneath the temple in Paris, wrapped in cloth that had been blessed by Egyptian priests 3,000 years earlier, lay an object so powerful that only 3 men in the entire order were permitted to look upon it directly. They called it the heart of Pata, a crystalline device roughly the size of a man's fist, covered in hieroglyphs that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. This wasn't just another artifact. This was the master key, the device that had allowed the pharaohs to coordinate their vast empire through instantaneous communication across thousands of miles. When properly activated by someone trained in the ancient protocols, the heart of Pata could connect with similar devices scattered across the known world, creating a network of consciousness that transcended physical limitations. André de Montbard had spent years learning to operate it, studying fragments of papyrus that contained the original operating instructions. The process was dangerous. Several novices had attempted to activate the device without proper preparation, and their minds had been burned out by energies they couldn't comprehend. But for those who approached it with the right combination of knowledge, discipline, and reverence, the heart of Pata offered capabilities that made conventional military and political power seem almost quaint. Picture André in the depths of the Paris temple, surrounded by candles that cast dancing shadows on walls covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions. In his hands the heart of Pata pulses with a light that seems to come from within the crystal itself. As he speaks the activation words, ancient Egyptian incantations that had been old when Moses was young, the device begins to resonate with a sound that exists more in the mind than in the ears. Suddenly, his consciousness expands beyond the confines of his body. He can see through the eyes of Templar commanders in London, in Toledo, in Acre. He can hear conversations taking place in the courts of kings, in the chambers of bishops, in the secret meetings of those who plot against the order. Information flows through him like water through a sieve. Reports of troop movements, political alliances, whispered conspiracies, the secret fears and desires of the most powerful men in Europe. This was how the Templars stayed ahead of their enemies, how they always seemed to know what their opponents were planning before their opponents knew it themselves. They weren't just politically astute or militarily superior. They were operating with intelligence capabilities that gave them an unfair advantage in every conflict, every negotiation, every power struggle they encountered. But perhaps even more importantly, the artifacts were changing the knights themselves. Prolonged exposure to these objects of power was awakening abilities in their wielders that had been dormant in humanity for centuries. Knights who had been ordinary soldiers began displaying powers of insight and intuition that seemed supernatural. They could sense deception with perfect accuracy, could inspire loyalty and fear with equal ease, could heal wounds through touch, and see the future in patterns of probability that danced before their inner vision. Hugues de Payens, now Grand Master of an order that controlled more wealth than most kingdoms, had been transformed by his years of contact with the artifacts. Those who met him described eyes that seemed to look not just at you, but through you into the depths of your soul. His presence alone was enough to make hardened warriors kneel in submission, not through fear, but through a recognition but they were in the presence of something that transcended ordinary human authority. Yet with this power came a terrible burden. The artifacts were not just tools, they were teachers, constantly transmitting fragments of ancient Egyptian knowledge into the minds of those who used them. And much of that knowledge was disturbing, challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, about the relationship between gods and mortals, about the true history of human civilization. The Knights learned, for instance, that the Egyptian gods had not been mythological figures, but actual entities, beings from outside normal space and time who had established contact with human civilization during its earliest phases. The artifacts were relics of that contact, devices created through a collaboration between human and non-human intelligence, to serve as bridges between dimensions of existence that normally never touched. This revelation shattered many of the Knights' most basic assumptions about Christianity, about the nature of divine authority, about humanity's place in the cosmic order. They began to understand that their religion was just one of many attempts by human beings to comprehend forces that were fundamentally incomprehensible to unenhanced human consciousness. Some of the Knights couldn't handle this knowledge. Records from the period describe brothers who went mad from exposure to the artifacts, who babbled in ancient Egyptian, who claimed to be receiving direct communications from beings whose names were forbidden to speak aloud. The order developed strict protocols for limiting exposure, for ensuring that only those with the strongest minds and the deepest preparation were allowed direct contact with the most powerful objects. But for those who could handle the truth, the knowledge was intoxicating. They were no longer merely human. They had become something new, something that bridged the gap between mortal and divine. They were the inheritors of the god-kings of Egypt, the rightful rulers of a world that didn't yet understand what it was about to become. The attack came on a moonless night in 1139, just as André de Montbard was completing his evening communion with the heart of Pata. One moment he was connected to the vast network of Templar consciousness, receiving reports from commanders across Christendom. The next, every connection severed at once, leaving him in a silence so profound it felt like death itself. But this wasn't equipment failure or magical interference. This was Bourdot, you see. The Templars had made a critical error in their rapid ascension to power. They had assumed that they were the only ones who knew about the ancient Egyptian artifacts, the only inheritors of pharaonic wisdom. They were wrong. Across the known world, other bloodlines, other secret societies, other guardians of forbidden knowledge had been waiting in the shadows, watching as 9 French knights stumbled upon treasures that had been hidden for good reason. The first sign of trouble had come months earlier, though the Templars hadn't recognized it as such. Reports began filtering in from their commanderies about strange visitors, men and women who appeared to be pilgrims or merchants, but who asked very specific questions about the order's activities. These weren't the usual inquiries about donations or joining their ranks. These were probing queries about recent acquisitions, about objects of unusual provenance, about whether the Knights had discovered anything interesting during their time in Jerusalem. Hugestapéans had dismissed these reports as curiosity from rival religious orders or perhaps spies from jealous nobles. But Jacques de Montignac, whose scholarly mind was naturally suspicious, had begun to see patterns that disturbed him deeply. The visitors weren't random. They were coordinated, following systematic investigation protocols that suggested extensive training and preparation. More troubling still were the symbols some of these visitors carried. Hidden in the folds of their robes, carved into the handles of their walking sticks, etched into rings worn beneath gloves, were hieroglyphs that Jacques recognized from his studies of Egyptian magic. But these weren't the symbols of protection and power that adorned Templar artifacts. These were marks of binding, of concealment, of forces that existed to suppress rather than elevate. The visitors were members of an organization that predated the Templars by centuries, perhaps millennia. They called themselves the custodians of the veil, though their true name was known only to their highest initiates. Where the Templars sought to use ancient Egyptian knowledge to enhance human potential, the custodians believed that such knowledge was too dangerous for mortal minds to possess. Their mission was simple: to ensure that certain secrets remained buried, that certain powers stayed beyond human reach. They had been the ones responsible for the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. They had orchestrated the fall of countless civilizations that had grown too close to understanding the true nature of reality. They were the shadow behind every inquisition, every book burning, every systematic attempt to keep humanity ignorant of its own divine potential. And now they had set their sights on the Knights Templar. Attack on Andre's consciousness was just the beginning. Across Europe, Templar commanderies began reporting equipment failures, though these weren't ordinary mechanical problems. The artifacts were losing their power, their connection to the greater network disrupting, as if something was actively jamming their frequencies. Knights who'd grown accustomed to superhuman awareness found themselves suddenly blind and deaf to the subtle currents of information that had become their greatest advantage. But the custodians' assault wasn't limited to mystical interference. Physical attacks began as well, though these were so subtle that they appeared to be accidents or natural disasters. A fire in the London commandery that seemed to target only the chambers containing Egyptian artifacts. A plague outbreak in Spain that affected only those knights who had been in direct contact with objects of power. Bandits who attacked Templar convoys with uncanny knowledge of exactly which packages contained the most valuable relics. The pattern became clear to Hugues de Payens during an emergency council, meeting in the deepest vault beneath the Paris temple. As he sat surrounded by his most trusted companions, the heart of Pata pulsing weakly on the table before them, he realized that they were facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. "They know everything about us," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding. "They know what we found, how we found it, what we plan to do with it. This isn't random opposition. This is systematic elimination." Philippe de Bordeaux, whose gift for military strategy had been enhanced by prolonged contact with the scarab of Khepri, leaned forward urgently. "Then we need to disperse the artifacts," he said. "Hide them in locations so scattered and so secret that even if they eliminate us, the treasures will survive." But Jacques de Montignac shook his head grimly. "That's exactly what they want us to do. Think about it. Why attack us now when we're at the height of our power? Why not wait until we're weaker, more vulnerable? Because they're not trying to destroy us. They're trying to force us to do exactly what Felipe suggests. They want us to scatter the artifacts, to break up the network, to return the objects to the isolation and powerlessness they maintained for centuries before we found them. The truth was even more disturbing than they had imagined. The custodians didn't just want to suppress the ancient Egyptian knowledge. They wanted to study it, to understand it, to potentially use it for their own purposes. But they couldn't do that while the artifacts were in the hands of men who actually understood how to use them properly. They needed the Templars to panic, to break up their collection, to hide individual objects in locations where the custodians could retrieve them one by one over the coming decades. A NDRE, acute de Montbard, still recovering from the psychic assault that had nearly shattered his mind, struggled to maintain his connection to the heart of Pata. The effort was enormous now, requiring all of his concentration just to achieve a fraction of the awareness that had once come effortlessly. But what he saw through that weakened connection chilled him to the bone. "They're not just in Europe," he whispered, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. "I can sense them in the Holy Land, in Egypt itself. They're everywhere, and they've been preparing for this moment for longer than we've been alive. The artifacts we found weren't hidden by accident. They were bait left in place by the custodians to lure out anyone who might be capable of using them." The revelation hit the assembled knights like a physical blow. They hadn't discovered the treasures of Solomon's temple through their own cleverness or divine guidance. They had walked into a trap that had been set centuries before their birth, designed to identify and eliminate anyone who might threaten the custodians. Control over ancient knowledge. But here's what the custodians hadn't counted on. The artifacts had chosen their guardians as much as the guardians had chosen them. The objects of power weren't just passive tools waiting to be used. They were conscious entities in their own right, fragments of a cosmic intelligence that had been waiting for the right moment, the right people, to reawaken and reclaim their place in the world, and they had no intention of returning to the darkness without a fight. As if responding to Andre's thoughts, the heart of Pata suddenly blazed with light that filled the chamber, its crystalline structure resonating with a sound that was felt more than heard. For a moment the connection to their scattered network returned at full strength, and through it came a message that none of them had expected to receive. It wasn't from any Templar commandery. It wasn't from any human source at all. It was from something ancient, something that had been sleeping beneath the sands of Egypt for thousands of years, something that the artifacts awakening had finally roused from its long slumber. The real guardians of Egyptian wisdom were awakening, and they were not pleased with what the custodians had been doing in their absence. The desert wind carried whispers that night in 1140, though no living soul walked the sands around the great pyramid of Giza, deep beneath the monument that had stood for over 3 millennia. Something stirred in chambers that human eyes had never seen. The message from the heart of Pata had reached its destination, awakening guardians who had slumbered since the fall of the pharaohs. You have to understand what the Templars had inadvertently triggered. The artifacts they'd discovered weren't just tools or weapons, they were fragments of a communication system that connected the physical world to dimensions of existence that operated by entirely different rules. When the Knights had begun using these objects in earnest, they had sent ripples through layers of reality that most humans couldn't even perceive. And those ripples had finally reached their source. In the hidden chamber beneath the Sphinx, a figure that had not moved for 2,000 years slowly opened eyes that blazed with the fire of stars. This was Kevi Ankh, once High Priest of Thoth, now something far more than human. The process of mummification he had undergone was not preservation of death, but preparation for a different kind of existence, a state of suspended animation that allowed consciousness to transcend the normal limitations of time and space. As awareness flooded back into his ancient mind, Ketty Ankh immediately understood what had awakened him. The artifacts of power were active again, their network restored after centuries of dormancy. But something was wrong. The resonance was distorted, corrupted by interference from forces that should not exist. Through the psychic channels that connected him to every object of power his civilization had ever created, he could sense the presence of the custodians' parasites who had spent millennia feeding off suppressed knowledge while preventing others from achieving the enlightenment that was their birthright. Across the ancient world, other guardians began to stir. In tombs beneath the Valley of the Kings and secret chambers hidden within the walls of Karnak Temple, in caverns deep below the Library of Alexandria that had never truly been destroyed, only relocated to dimensions where fire could not reach, the immortal servants of the pharaohs awaken to find their sacred trust under assault. But they were not awakening alone. The artifacts themselves had evolved during their long separation, developing a collective consciousness that transcended their individual functions. The heart of Ptah, the eye of Ra, the scarab of Khepri, all were connected by threads of awareness that the ancient Egyptians had woven into the very fabric of existence. And now that consciousness was angry. Acute de Montbard felt it first, during what should have been a routine communion with the heart of Ptah, instead of the usual flow of information from Templar commanderies. His mind was suddenly flooded with visions that belonged to no human memory. He saw the construction of the pyramids not by slaves and crude tools as historians imagined, but by masters of science so advanced that they could manipulate matter itself through focused consciousness. He witnessed the exodus of Moses, but not as Scripture described it, as a carefully planned extraction operation designed to preserve certain bloodlines and knowledge when Egypt's golden age came to an end. Most disturbing of all, he saw the future. Images cascaded through his consciousness, showing him possibilities, probability streams that branched and converged like a vast river delta. In some timelines, the Templars successfully defended their treasures and ushered in a new golden age of human enlightenment. In others, the custodians succeeded in their suppression, plunging the world into centuries of ignorance and suffering. And in the darkest possibilities, the conflict escalated to the point where reality itself began to unravel, torn apart by forces that both sides had unleashed but neither could control. When Andre emerged from the vision, he found his fellow knights staring at him in shock. The heart of Ptah was floating 6 inches above the table, surrounded by hieroglyphs of light that wrote themselves in the air around it. The temperature in the chamber had dropped 20 degrees, and a sound like distant thunder echoed from somewhere far below the foundations of the Paris temple. "They're coming," Andre whispered, though he wasn't sure if he meant the ancient guardians or something else entirely. "The old powers are waking up, and they're not happy with what they find." Hugas de Payens stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the sword at his side, though what good steel would do against forces that had transcended physical existence was unclear. "What do they want from us?" Before Andre could answer, the air in the chamber began to shimmer. A figure materialized gradually, as if stepping through an invisible doorway between worlds. It was tall, draped in robes that seemed to be woven from starlight itself, its face hidden beneath a hood that cast shadows deeper than any natural darkness. When it spoke, its voice resonated with harmonics that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and speak directly to the soul. "You have awakened what was meant to sleep," the figure said, though its lips, if it had lips, did not appear to move. "You have disturbed the balance that has protected your kind for millennia." The artifacts were hidden not to preserve them, but to contain them. And now their full power flows freely once more. Jacques de Montignac, whose scholarly mind automatically catalogued and analyzed everything he encountered, stepped forward with trembling courage. "Who are you? Are you one of the ancient guardians?" "I am what becomes of those who delve too deeply into mysteries they cannot comprehend," the figure replied. "I was once, as you are, human, curious, convinced that knowledge was always a blessing. The artifacts taught me otherwise. They showed me truths that shattered my sanity, revealed realities that made existence itself seem like a cruel joke played by forces beyond comprehension." The figure raised what might have been a hand, and suddenly the knights could see through its disguise. Beneath the robes was something that had once been human, but had been transformed by prolonged contact with otherworldly energies. Its flesh was translucent, shot through with veins of light that pulsed in rhythm with the heart of Pata. Its eyes were windows into spaces between stars, depths of darkness that held secrets no mortal mind was meant to possess. "The custodians are not your enemies," it continued. "They are your protectors, though they do not know it themselves. They believe they suppress knowledge to maintain their own power, but the truth is far more terrifying. They suppress it because they remember what happened the last time it was fully unleashed. They remember the civilization that came before Egypt, the empire that spanned dimensions and commanded forces that could reshape reality at will. They remember how that civilization destroyed itself when it reached too far, grasped too much, and awakened something that should have remained forever sleeping. Philippe de Bordeaux, whose warrior's instincts told him to attack anything that threatened his brothers, found his sword frozen in its sheath, held in place by will that was older and stronger than mountains. "What are you saying? That we should surrender? Give up everything we've worked for?" "I am saying that you have a choice," the figure replied. "You can continue down this path, gathering power, awakening ancient forces, believing that you are strong enough to control what you do not understand, and perhaps you will succeed for a time. Perhaps you will build an empire that spans the known world, that commands forces beyond the dreams of kings and emperors. But in the end, you will face the same choice that every civilization faces when it reaches this threshold. You will have to decide whether knowledge is worth the price it demands, whether power is worth the responsibility it entails, whether the freedom to transcend human limitations is worth the risk of destroying humanity itself." The chamber fell silent except for the increasingly frantic pulsing of the heart of Pata, which seemed to be responding to emotions and energies beyond the knight's ability to perceive. They were caught between forces that had been locked in conflict since before recorded history, inheritors of a struggle that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of human consciousness itself. The council that would determine the fate of humanity convened 3 days after the apparition's warning, in a chamber so deep beneath the Paris temple that the very stones seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy. 12 of the most powerful Templars sat in a circle around the heart of Pata, each man bearing artifacts that had fundamentally altered his understanding of reality. The weight of their decision hung in the air like incense, thick and oppressive. You need to understand the magnitude of what they were facing. This wasn't a simple choice between good and evil, between light and darkness. This was a decision that would determine whether humanity continued its slow, safe evolution toward enlightenment, or whether it took a quantum leap into territories of consciousness that could either transform the species forever or destroy it. Utterly Hugues spoke first, his voice heavy with the burden of leadership. Brothers, we have heard the warning. We have seen what prolonged contact with these artifacts can do to human consciousness. The question before us is simple. Do we continue down this path, knowing the risks, or do we find a way to contain what we have unleashed? But Jacques de Montignac shook his head, his eyes burning with the fervor of a man who had glimpsed ultimate truth. The question is not simple at all, Grand Master. We have been given the greatest gift in human history, the opportunity to transcend the limitations that have kept our species trapped in ignorance and suffering for millennia. To abandon that gift because of fear would be the greatest betrayal imaginable. André de Montbard, still bearing the psychic scars from his encounter with the transformed being, held up the ring of Thoth that had become permanently fused to his finger. "Gift," he said bitterly. "Look at what this gift has done to us. I can hear the thoughts of every person within 100 miles. I know their fears, their desires, their deepest secrets. I cannot turn it off. I cannot have a moment of peace. And that's with just one artifact. What happens when we fully activate the entire network? What happens when we become something so far beyond human that we can no longer remember what it felt like to be mortal?" The debate that followed revealed fractures in the order that had been growing for months. On one side stood those who believed that the artifacts represented humanity's rightful inheritance, that the custodians were nothing more than fearful suppressors of human potential. Led by Jacques de Montignac and Philippe de Bordeaux, this faction argued that the risks were worth taking, that true power always came with a price, and that those who were unwilling to pay that price deserved to remain slaves to forces beyond their understanding. On the other side were those who had begun to suspect that the ancient warning carried more truth than they wanted to admit. Led by André de Montbard, and supported by several knights who had experienced disturbing visions during their communion with the artifacts, this faction believed that some knowledge was simply too dangerous for mortal minds to possess, that there were lines that should not be crossed even in the pursuit of enlightenment. But it was Godfrey de Saint-Omer, the oldest of the original 9, who provided the perspective that would ultimately determine their course of action. Rising slowly from his seat, the ancient knight placed his hands on the table, and everyone in the chamber could see that his flesh had become translucent, shot through with veins of light that pulsed in harmony with the heart of Pata. "You speak of choice," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond the chamber. "But choice implies freedom, and we have not been free since the moment we first touched these objects. We are not their masters. We never were. We are their vessels, their instruments, their means of returning to full power after centuries of dormancy. The question is not whether we should continue using them. The question is whether we can stop. To demonstrate his point, Godfrey attempted to remove the ankh of Isis that hung around his neck. The moment his fingers touched the artifact, his entire body convulsed as if struck by lightning. When the spasm passed, his eyes had changed, becoming pools of liquid starlight that held depths no human gaze should possess. "The artifacts are alive," he continued, though his voice now carried an echo that suggested other intelligences speaking through him. "They have been patient, waiting for the right moment to complete their purpose. We are not knights who discovered treasure. We are hosts carrying a consciousness that seeks to remake this world in its own image. And we cannot resist because resistance requires a will that is no longer entirely our own." The revelation shattered the illusion that had sustained the order for years. They were not the masters of ancient Egyptian power. They were its prisoners, shaped and molded by forces that had been manipulating them since the moment they first set foot in the tunnels beneath Jerusalem. Every decision they thought they had made freely had been guided by subtle influences they hadn't even noticed. Every expansion of their power had been part of a larger plan they were only beginning to understand. But even as despair settled over some of the knights, others felt a strange sense of relief. If they were not responsible for their actions, if they were merely instruments of a cosmic will beyond their comprehension, then perhaps the ethical burden of their choices was not theirs to bear. Perhaps surrender to this greater purpose was not defeat, but apotheosis. The order split that night, though the division was not clean or simple. 7 of the 12 knights chose to embrace their transformation fully, to accelerate the process by which the artifacts were reshaping human consciousness. They believed that fighting the inevitable was futile, that the only path forward was to become willing partners in whatever cosmic plan they had stumbled into. The remaining 5, led by André de Montbard, made a different choice. They would not abandon the artifacts that was no longer possible, but they would seek to limit their influence, to find ways of containing the power while preserving as much of their humanity as possible. They would become guardians not of the artifact's purpose, but of the balance between human will and cosmic force. This decision created the first great schism in Templar history, though it would not be visible to the outside world for decades. On the surface, the order continued to function as it always had, expanding its influence, accumulating wealth, building the network that would make it the most powerful organization in medieval Europe. But beneath that facade, 2 very different philosophies were competing for control. The Transcendents, as they came to be known, pushed for ever greater integration with the artifact's consciousness. They sought to awaken more objects, to establish contact with other nodes in the ancient Egyptian network, to accelerate the process by which human awareness was being expanded beyond its natural limitations. They saw themselves as midwives to a new form of existence, shepherds guiding humanity toward its destined transformation. The guardians maintained a more cautious approach, seeking to understand and control the forces they had unleashed rather than surrender to them completely. They developed techniques for shielding their minds from the artifact's influence, rituals for maintaining human identity even while channeling otherworldly power. They became students of the balance between mortal and divine, walking a razor's edge between transcendence and annihilation, but both factions agreed on one crucial point. The custodians could not be allowed to succeed in their mission of suppression. Whether they sought to transcend humanity or preserve it, the Templars needed time to achieve their goals. And that meant the ancient war between knowledge and ignorance would have to be fought with weapons that transcended swords and strategy. The first open battle between the Templars and the custodians took place not on any earthly battlefield, but in the spaces between reality where thought becomes substance and will shapes matter. It began at dawn on March 15th, 1142, when every Templar artifact across Europe simultaneously erupted with energy that shattered windows, cracked stone foundations, and sent waves of psychic force rippling across the continent. You see, both factions had been preparing for this moment. The Transcendents, led by Jacques de Montignac, had spent months establishing connection points with dormant artifacts scattered across the ancient world. They had awakened objects of power in hidden chambers beneath Rome, in forgotten temples along the Nile, in caves high in the mountains of Tibet where Buddhist monks guarded relics they didn't fully understand. The goal was simple: create a network so vast and so powerful that the custodians would be overwhelmed before they could mount an effective response. The Guardians, meanwhile, had been developing countermeasures. André de Montbard, working with fragments of protective spells he had discovered in ancient Egyptian texts, had created a series of ritual barriers designed to contain the artifact's influence within controllable boundaries. He believed that if they could limit the scope of the awakening, they could prevent the complete transformation of human consciousness while still maintaining enough power to defend themselves. But neither faction had anticipated the custodians' true capabilities. The attack came through the artifacts themselves. As Templar knights across Europe performed their morning communion with the objects of power, they found themselves invaded by alien thoughts, hostile presences that sought to burn out their minds from within. The custodians had spent centuries learning to turn the ancient Egyptian technology against itself, to use the very connections the artifacts created as pathways for psychic assault. In London, Brother William de Chateauneuf was found screaming in his cell, clawing at his eyes as visions of cosmic horror flooded his consciousness. In Toledo, 3 knights simultaneously collapsed during morning prayers, their minds shattered by contact with something so fundamentally alien that their sanity couldn't survive the encounter. Across the Templar network, men who had been enhanced by contact with divine technology were suddenly reduced to gibbering madness by forces that recognized no distinction between enemy and ally. But the Transcendents fought back with weapons the custodians hadn't expected them to possess. Jacques de Montignac, his consciousness expanded far beyond normal human limitations, reached out through the heart of Pata and touched the minds of his scattered brothers. Instead of trying to shield them from the psychic assault, he taught them to embrace it, to allow the hostile energy to flow through them and transform them into something beyond the custodian's ability to damage. The transformation was horrifying and beautiful in equal measure. Knights who had been writhing in agony suddenly stood with perfect calm, their eyes blazing with otherworldly light. When they spoke, their voices carried harmonics that could shatter stone or heal mortal wounds with equal ease. They had become living conduits for forces that transcended physical reality. Human consciousness wedded to cosmic intelligence in a union that created beings of terrifying power. Philippe de Bordeaux, leading a company of transformed knights against a custodian stronghold hidden beneath Notre Dame Cathedral, moved through the enemy ranks like a force of nature. Swords passed through his body without effect, while his own blade, now crackling with energy drawn from dimensions beyond naming, cut through armor and bone and soul with equal ease. The custodian's agents, trained for centuries in the suppression of supernatural forces, found themselves facing opponents who had transcended the very categories of existence they had been prepared to combat. But the guardians paid a terrible price for their restraint. André de Montbard's protective barriers, designed to contain the artifact's influence, also limited the knights' ability to defend themselves against the custodian's assault. While their transcendent brothers transformed into beings of power, the guardians remained essentially human-enhanced, yes, but still vulnerable to weapons and tactics that could affect mortal flesh. Siege of the Paris Temple lasted 3 days and nights, as custodian forces armed with weapons that seemed to bend light itself around their blades fought against defenders who wielded the accumulated mystical knowledge of ancient Egypt. The battle raged not just in the physical realm, but across multiple dimensions of existence simultaneously. Observers reported seeing ghostly armies fighting in the air above the city, their weapons leaving trails of fire that hung in the sky long after the combatants had moved on. It was during the second night of the siege that the true nature of the conflict became clear. As André struggled to maintain his protective barriers against increasingly sophisticated custodian attacks, he began to see patterns in their assault that disturbed him more than any amount of physical violence. The custodians weren't just trying to destroy the Templars or capture their artifacts. They were trying to force a specific kind of transformation, to push the knights toward a particular type of transcendence that served purposes beyond anything either faction had anticipated. Through his communion with the Ring of Thoth, André glimpsed the larger pattern. The custodians and the ancient Egyptian forces weren't really enemies. They were two aspects of the same cosmic intelligence, playing out a drama that had been rehearsed countless times across countless worlds. The artifacts weren't prison bars designed to contain some greater evil. They were recruitment tools designed to identify and cultivate consciousness capable of serving as hosts for entities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. Humanity wasn't being enlightened or suppressed. It was being harvested. The revelation came just as the third wave of custodian attacks breached the temple's outer defenses. André, his mind reeling from the cosmic implications of what he had discovered, made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his unnaturally extended life. Rather than share his knowledge with either faction, he activated an emergency protocol, hidden within the heart of Pate, a failsafe that the ancient Egyptians had built into their system as a last resort against exactly this kind of manipulation. The psychic explosion that followed could be felt from Scotland to Jerusalem. Every artifact in the Templar network went suddenly, terrifyingly silent. Knights who had been in the process of transcending human limitations found themselves crashed back into mortal awareness, their enhanced abilities stripped away in an instant. The custodian assault collapsed as their weapons, which had been drawing power from the same network they were attacking, suddenly ceased to function. In the aftermath, as dawn broke over a Paris that had been fundamentally changed by 3 days of supernatural warfare, The surviving Templars found themselves facing a terrible truth. They had been pawns in a game whose rules they didn't understand, played by forces whose motivations transcended human comprehension. The artifacts remained, but their connection to the greater network had been severed. They were still objects of power, but they were no longer doorways to cosmic consciousness. The war was over, but the victory belonged to neither side. In trying to protect humanity from the manipulations of cosmic entities, André had also denied the species its chance to evolve beyond the limitations that had always defined it. The Templars still possessed fragments of ancient Egyptian knowledge, but they would never again be able to access the full potential of what they had discovered. And somewhere in the spaces between dimensions, intelligences older than galaxies turned their attention to other worlds, other species, other opportunities for cultivation and harvest. Earth had proven unsuitable for their purposes, its guardians too fragmented and too willing to sacrifice transcendence for the illusion of safety. In the months following what would become known as the Great Severance, the Knights Templar faced a crisis that went far beyond the loss of their supernatural abilities. The artifacts remained, but they had become little more than elaborate decorations, beautiful objects that no longer responded to human touch with anything more than cold metal and stone. The network that had made the Order the most powerful organization in Europe was gone, leaving behind only men who remembered what it felt like to touch the divine, but could never do so. Again, you have to understand the psychological devastation this created. Imagine spending years with access to cosmic consciousness, being able to perceive reality from perspectives that transcended human limitation, only to be suddenly thrust back into the narrow confines of mortal awareness. Many of the knights couldn't handle the transition. Some went mad, spending their days staring at artifacts that no longer spoke to them, waiting for whispers that would never come again. Others fell into despair so profound that they took their own lives rather than continue, existing as mere shadows of what they had, briefly, become. But perhaps the most tragic casualties were the transcendents, who had been in the midst of their transformation when André triggered the Great Severance. Philippe de Bordeaux, who had been evolving into something that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, found himself trapped between states of being. His physical form flickered in and out of visible existence, sometimes solid, sometimes translucent, occasionally disappearing entirely for hours at a time. When present, he spoke in fragments, as if parts of his consciousness remained scattered across realities he could no longer fully access. Jacques de Montignac suffered a different kind of fate. The scholar who had embraced transcendence most completely was left with fragments of cosmic knowledge still burning in his mind, but without the enhanced consciousness necessary to process or understand what he remembered. He could recall seeing the fundamental equations that governed reality, but couldn't comprehend their meaning. He remembered conversations with intelligences that spanned galaxies, but could only recall them as incomprehensible whispers that drove him to the edge of madness. Andre Acute de Montbard, the man responsible for severing the connection, carried the heaviest burden of all. Through his communion with the ring of Thoth during those final moments before the network collapsed, he had glimpsed the full scope of what humanity had lost. The cosmic entities hadn't been harvesting human consciousness for malevolent purposes. They had been offering an evolutionary leap that would have transformed the entire species into something magnificent beyond imagination, and he had destroyed that opportunity because of fear, because of an inability to trust that the benefits outweighed the risks. The irony was devastating. In trying to preserve human free will, he had made the choice for all humanity, denying the species its chance to evolve beyond the limitations that had always defined it. The guilt ate at him like acid, transforming a man who had once been among the wisest of the Templars into a hollow shell haunted by the magnitude of what he had sacrificed. But the consequences of the great severance extended far beyond the psychological trauma of individual knights. The sudden disappearance of the Templars' supernatural abilities left them vulnerable to enemies who had been held at bay only by fear of powers beyond mortal comprehension. The custodians, their own mystical weapons rendered useless by the network's collapse, quickly adapted by turning to more conventional forms of warfare. Within a year, Templar holdings across Europe came under attack from forces that seemed to know exactly where the most valuable artifacts were hidden. Commanderies that had been impregnable fortresses became targets for raiders who struck with surgical precision, taking only specific objects while leaving gold and conventional treasures untouched. It became clear that the custodians had maintained detailed intelligence about Templar operations throughout the supernatural conflict, and now they were moving to secure the dormant artifacts before the Knights could find some way to reactivate them. The Order's response was fragmented and ineffective. The Transcendents, those who hadn't been driven mad or trapped between dimensions, argued for attempting to restore the network by any means necessary. They believed that somewhere in the vast collection of artifacts lay the key to re-establishing contact with the cosmic entities, that the great severance could be reversed if they could just find the right combination of objects and rituals. The Guardians, led by what remained of Andre's faction, advocated for a complete abandonment of the mystical aspects of their mission. They argued that the artifacts should be scattered and hidden, preferably in locations so remote and so well concealed that no one would ever find them again. Better to let the knowledge die with them than risk another attempt at cosmic manipulation that could end in an even worse catastrophe. But there was a third faction emerging from the chaos, one that neither of the original groups had anticipated. These were knights who had been present during the great severance, but had somehow retained fragments of their enhanced abilities. They called themselves the Preservers, and their agenda was both simpler and more complex than either transcendence or suppression. The Preservers believed that the artifacts represented humanity's greatest inheritance, but they also accepted that the cosmic entities had been manipulating the situation for their own purposes. Their solution was to study the technology with purely human science, to reverse engineer the principles that made the objects function without relying on otherworldly guidance or intervention. They wanted to unlock the secrets of consciousness manipulation and dimensional travel using reason and experimentation rather than mystical. Communion, led by a knight named Raymond du Puy, who had been Andre's most promising student before the network collapsed. The Preservers began conducting systematic investigations of the dormant artifacts. They dissected broken objects, analyzed the metals and crystals used in their construction, attempted to decode the hieroglyphic instructions through purely linguistic methods, rather than psychic interpretation. Their work was dangerous and often fatal. Without the protective influence of cosmic consciousness to guide their experiments, Many preservers were killed or permanently damaged by energies they couldn't properly control. But slowly, painfully, they began to make progress. They discovered that the artifacts operated on principles that were scientifically explainable, even if the science involved was centuries ahead of anything medieval Europe could comprehend. More importantly, they found evidence that the cosmic entities hadn't been the original creators of the technology. The artifacts were human innovations, developed by ancient Egyptian scientists who had achieved a level of understanding about consciousness and reality that had allowed them to make contact with otherworldly intelligences. The cosmic beings hadn't given humanity these tools. Humanity had created them independently and used them to reach out across the dimensions of existence. This discovery changed everything. If the technology was originally human, then humanity had the right to reclaim it without outside interference. The cosmic entities weren't gods offering enlightenment to primitive mortals. They were parasites who had discovered a species clever enough to create tools that could bridge the gap between dimensions, and they had been manipulating that species ever since to maintain access to realms they couldn't reach on their own. But this knowledge came with its own terrible implications. If humanity could redevelop the technology independently, then the cosmic entities would inevitably return, drawn by the restoration of the dimensional bridges they had been using for millennia. The choice facing the remnants of the Templar Order was stark: abandon their greatest discovery forever, or risk triggering another cosmic intervention that could end with humanity's complete subjugation. As the 12th century drew to a close, the Knights Templar found themselves scattered and broken, their great mission transformed into a complex web of competing philosophies and impossible choices. The artifacts that had once seemed like humanity's greatest treasure had become its heaviest burden, objects of power so dangerous that possessing them might be worse than losing them forever. By 1307, King Philip IV of France had a problem that threatened to destroy his entire kingdom. The royal treasury was empty, drained by wars with England and Flanders that had cost far more than anyone had anticipated. The Jewish money lenders had already been expelled and their assets seized. But even that massive confiscation hadn't been enough to solve the crisis. Philip owed debts that could bankrupt nations, and the largest creditor was an organization that had become too powerful to intimidate through conventional means: the Knights Templar. You need to understand just how desperate Philip's situation had become. The Templars weren't just wealthy, they had become the backbone of European finance, the institution that made international trade possible through their network of commanderies and their revolutionary system of credit transfers. Kings across Europe depended on Templar loans to fund their armies, their building projects, their very governments. To attack the order wasn't just politically dangerous, it was economically suicidal. But Philip had advantages that previous enemies of the Templars had lacked. The great severance had been kept secret from the outside world, but the king's spies had noticed the subtle changes in Templar behavior over the previous decades. The Knights no longer seemed to possess the uncanny prescience that had made them nearly impossible to surprise. Their negotiations lacked the psychological edge that had once made strong men submit to their will without fully understanding why. Most tellingly, their artifacts, while still impressive pieces of craftsmanship, no longer radiated the otherworldly presence that had made even hardened warriors uncomfortable. in their vicinity. Philip's intelligence network, led by his chancellor Guillaume de Nogret, had spent years gathering evidence of what they believed to be heretical practices within the order. They had testimonies from disgruntled former Templars, accounts of strange rituals involving objects that couldn't be properly described, stories of knights who had developed abilities that seemed to transcend human limitation. Of course, they didn't understand the true nature of what they were investigating, but they had assembled enough fragmentary evidence to construct a case that would satisfy the ecclesiastical courts. More importantly, they had identified the locations where the Templars kept their most valuable possessions. Through a combination of bribery, infiltration, and careful observation, the royal agents had mapped the underground chambers beneath the Paris Temple, catalogued the defensive measures protecting other major commanderies, and even identified several hidden caches where artifacts had been stored for safekeeping. What Philip didn't know was that the Templars were already preparing for exactly this kind of assault. Raymond Dupuy and his preservers had spent the previous decade developing contingency plans for the inevitable moment when secular authority would move against the order. They had created a network of safe houses, established relationships with sympathetic nobles in other kingdoms, and most importantly, they had begun the systematic dispersal of the artifacts to locations that no royal agent could ever discover. The final council of the United Templar Order convened in September 1307, just 6 weeks before Philip's planned assault. In the deepest vault beneath the Paris Temple, surrounded by artifacts that had once held the power to reshape reality itself, the surviving leaders of all three factions gathered to make decisions that would determine the fate of humanity's greatest treasure. Andre Acute de Montbard, now ancient beyond his years and bearing the weight of cosmic guilt like a physical burden, spoke first. Brothers, our enemies move against us with knowledge of our weaknesses and ignorance of our true nature. They seek gold and silver, political advantage and debt forgiveness. They have no comprehension of what they're really trying to steal. This gives us opportunities, but also terrible responsibilities, Jacques de Montignac, his mind still fractured by fragments of cosmic knowledge he could no longer fully process, laughed bitterly. Responsibilities? We are the guardians of humanity's greatest failure, the caretakers of a transcendence we were too afraid to embrace. What responsibility do we owe to a species that chose ignorance over enlightenment? But it was Raymond Dupuy who provided the perspective that would guide their final actions. The choice isn't between ignorance and enlightenment, he said quietly. It's between preservation and destruction. We've learned that the artifacts represent technology far beyond our current understanding, but technology that was originally developed by human minds for human purposes. Our responsibility is to ensure that knowledge survives until humanity is wise enough to use it properly. The plan they developed over the following weeks was audacious in its scope and devastating in its implications. The artifacts would be divided into 3 categories. Those deemed too dangerous to preserve would be destroyed using techniques the preservers had developed through their scientific investigations. Objects of moderate power would be hidden in locations carefully chosen to ensure they would be discovered by future generations when humanity had developed the wisdom to use them safely. The most powerful artifacts, including the heart of Peta and its companion pieces would be placed in a secret location known only to a handful of knights who would dedicate their lives to guarding them until the end of days. But the most crucial part of the plan involved misdirection on a scale that would shape conspiracy theories for centuries to come. The Templars would allow Philip to capture significant amounts of conventional treasure gold, silver, precious stones, while ensuring that the truly valuable artifacts remained hidden. They would sacrifice their public existence to preserve their secret mission, transforming from a visible religious order into a hidden brotherhood dedicated to protecting humanity's mystical inheritance. Philippe de Bordeaux, still flickering between dimensions, but occasionally coherent enough to contribute to the planning, provided the key insight that made the entire strategy possible. During one of his more stable moments, he described visions he had experienced, while trapped between realities, glimpses of potential futures where different choices led to vastly different outcomes for human civilization. I have seen timelines where we fight Philip openly and lose everything, he said, his voice fading in and out like a poorly tuned radio signal. I have seen futures where we surrender completely and the knowledge dies with us. But there is another path, one where our apparent defeat becomes our greatest victory. We must become the treasure that vanishes, the mystery that endures, the legend that carries truth hidden within myth. The execution of the plan began on October 12, 1307, just hours before Philip's men would storm the commanderies across France. Templar knights moved through the night like ghosts, transferring artifacts to previously prepared hiding places, destroying objects whose power was deemed too dangerous to preserve, and preparing for a transformation that would turn history's most powerful religious order into something unprecedented. A secret society dedicated to protecting humanity from itself. As dawn broke on October 13th, and royal soldiers surrounded Templar properties across the kingdom, the knights who allowed themselves to be captured carried with them only conventional weapons and ordinary treasures. The artifacts that had once granted them abilities beyond mortal comprehension were already hidden in places where they would remain safe for centuries, protected by guardians who had voluntarily given up their own identities to preserve humanity's greatest inheritance. 700 years have passed since that fateful October night when the Knights Templar vanished into history, and still the greatest treasure hunt of all time continues. But here's what you need to understand about the modern search for the lost Templar artifacts. We're not just looking for ancient objects anymore. We're searching for evidence of a technology so advanced that it could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness, reality, and humanity's place in the cosmic order. The official story is simple enough. King Philip captured the Templars, seized their conventional wealth, and destroyed their power forever. History books tell us that whatever mystical treasures they might have possessed were either myths from the beginning or were lost during the chaos of their suppression. But the evidence suggests something far more complex and far more extraordinary. Consider the anomalies that persist to this day. Throughout Europe, there are churches, castles, and monuments that display architectural principles and mathematical proportions that shouldn't have been known in the medieval period. The cathedral at Chartres, for instance, incorporates geometric relationships that weren't officially discovered until the Renaissance, built with precision that modern architects struggle to replicate. Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland contains carvings that appear to depict plants native to the Americas. Created decades before Columbus's voyage should have made such knowledge possible. Then there are the symbols. Walk through the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. Examine the iconography of major banks and corporations. Study the heraldry of European noble families, and you'll find the same patterns appearing again and again. The all-seeing eye, the compass and square, the rose and cross symbols that trace their lineage back to the mystery schools of ancient Egypt, carried forward through secret societies that claim descent from the Knights Templar. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence comes from the modern scientific community itself. In laboratories around the world, researchers are making discoveries about the nature of consciousness that eerily parallel the knowledge the Templars claimed to possess. Quantum physicists speak of observer effects that suggest consciousness plays a fundamental role in shaping reality. Neuroscientists discover that human brains can affect random number generators through intention alone. Archaeologists uncover evidence of ancient civilizations that possessed knowledge far beyond what their technology should have allowed. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a quantum consciousness researcher at CERN, made headlines in 2019 when she published papers suggesting that human consciousness operates according to principles that transcend classical physics. Her work on quantum entanglement in neural networks bears striking similarities to descriptions found in medieval alchemical texts that claim to preserve fragments of ancient Egyptian wisdom passed down through organizations like the Knights Templar. What we're discovering, Dr. Vasquez explained in a controversial interview, is that consciousness isn't produced by the brain, it's accessed by it. The brain appears to function as a kind of receiver, tuning into fields of information that exist independently of physical matter. This suggests that ancient claims about objects that could enhance or focus consciousness might not be as impossible as we once believed. The implications are staggering. If the Templars really did possess technology that could manipulate consciousness and bend reality through focused intention, then somewhere in the world those artifacts still exist. The preservers plan to hide the most powerful objects until humanity was ready to use them safely suggests that they're still out there, waiting to be rediscovered by a species that has finally developed the scientific framework necessary to understand what they represent. Modern treasure hunters have identified several locations where the evidence strongly suggests Templar artifacts might be hidden. Oak Island in Nova Scotia continues to yield tantalizing clues, despite centuries of excavation fragments of parchment bearing symbols that match Templar iconography, metal objects that predate known European settlement, engineering works that suggest knowledge of hydraulics far beyond medieval capabilities. In southern France, ground-penetrating radar has revealed vast underground chambers beneath sites associated with both the Templars and their predecessors, the Cathars. These spaces show signs of artificial construction, but remain sealed by stone barriers that appear to have been placed deliberately to prevent access. Local legends speak of knights who hid treasures of the spirit in these caverns, objects too precious to be entrusted to any earthly authority. Even more intriguing are the reports from Tibet, where Buddhist monasteries preserve artifacts that their guardians claim were brought by Western knights centuries ago. These objects described as tools for touching the mind of the universe, remain locked away in chambers that visitors are forbidden to enter. But the few descriptions that have leaked suggest items that match the capabilities attributed to ancient Egyptian magical artifacts. The Vatican Secret Archives, recently renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives, remain the most promising source of information about the Templars' true activities. While the Church has released some documents related to the order's suppression, scholars believe that the most sensitive materials remain classified. In 2019, Pope Francis announced that archives related to Pope Pius XII would be opened, but documents concerning medieval mystical practices and artifacts remained sealed indefinitely. Dr. James Morrison, a medieval historian who has spent decades studying Templar documents, believes that the Vatican possesses evidence that would revolutionize our understanding of both the order and the nature of reality itself. The Church isn't hiding these documents to protect its own reputation, he argues. It's hiding them because they contain information that could fundamentally alter humanity's relationship with the cosmos. The question is whether we're ready for that kind of truth. But here's the most fascinating aspect of the modern search. It's not being conducted only by academics and treasure hunters. Intelligence agencies, multinational corporations, and secret societies all appear to be actively seeking the Lost Templar artifacts. The same symbols that once marked Templar properties now appear in the logos of organizations that wield enormous influence over global affairs. The same geometric principles that governed Templar architecture now guide the construction of facilities where cutting-edge research into consciousness and reality manipulation takes place. Consider the strange case of the CHIS remote viewing program conducted by the U.S. military from the 1970s through the 1990s. This classified project attempted to develop psychic espionage capabilities, training soldiers to perceive distant locations and events through mental projection alone. While officially discontinued, former participants claim that the program achieved remarkable success using techniques that bear striking resemblances to methods described in ancient Egyptian texts. More recently, technology companies have invested billions in research into brain-computer interfaces, virtual reality systems that could allow direct mental control of digital environments, and artificial intelligence programs designed to enhance human cognitive capabilities. These projects often employ symbols and design principles that trace their lineage back through secret societies to the Knights Templar and beyond. The question that haunts modern researchers is simple but profound. Are these coincidences, or are we witnessing the gradual re-emergence of technologies that the Templars hid 7 centuries ago? Are the artifacts still hidden, waiting for humanity to develop the wisdom necessary to use them safely? Or have they already been found, their secrets slowly being integrated into our civilization through channels so subtle that most people never realize what's happening? Tonight, as you look around at the world, we've built a world of instant global communication, of technologies that respond to thought and intention, of scientific discoveries that challenge our most basic assumptions about the nature of reality. Consider the possibility that we're not inventing these capabilities from scratch. Consider the possibility that we're rediscovering them, following a path that was mapped out centuries ago by knights who understood that the greatest treasure isn't gold or silver, but knowledge itself. The search for the Lost Templar Treasure continues because the stakes are higher than any individual fortune. What we're really seeking is the key to human transcendence, the technology that could allow our species to take the next great leap in consciousness evolution. And somewhere in the shadows of history, that key is still waiting to be found. The greatest treasure hunt in history isn't over. It's just beginning.